Hello there, are you ready for our next chapter of George's Marvellous Medicine? Okay, now George and his dad have made Marvellous Medicine number 2, but they forgot a few things when they were making the recipe. So now they're trying again, and we have a chapter called Marvellous Medicine number 3. Here it is, cried Mr. Killiecrankie, rushing into the kitchen. 1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish. George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan, and then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. Stir it up, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it another boil. We've got it this time. I bet we've got it. After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping about with excitement. Come and watch this one, he called out to Mrs. Cranky. Come and watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs. I hope you do better than the last time, said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. Come on, chicken, said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. Good chicken, chick, 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 chick. Have some of this lovely medicine. A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb, that's the bit down the back, came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and went peck. Cock-a-doodle-doo! Squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. Watch him now, cried Mr. Cranky. Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger. Mr. Killiecrankie, Mrs. Cranky and little George. Oh, Mr. Killiecrankie, sorry. Start it again. Mr. Killiecrankie, Mrs. Cranky and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. What's happening to its neck? Mrs. Cranky said. It's getting longer, George said. I'll say it's getting longer, Mrs. Cranky said. And Mr. Cranky, for once, said nothing. Last time it was the legs, Mrs. Cranky said, and now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat chickens' necks. It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now 6 feet long. All right, George, Mr. Cranky said. What else have you forgotten? I don't know, George said. Oh, yes, you do, Mr. Cranky said. Come along, boy. Think. There's probably just one vital missing thing, and you've got to remember it. I put in some engine oil from the garage, George said. Did you have that on your list? Eureka! Cried Mr. Cranky. That's the answer. How much did you put in? About 300 millilitres, George said. Mr. Cranky ran up to the garage and found another 300 millilitres of oil. And antifreeze, called George after him. I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze. Next chapter's called Marvellous Medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half of the 300 millilitres of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. Boil it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boil it and stir it. George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget, you don't just have to have the same things. but you've got to have exactly the same amount of those things. And how can you possibly do that? Mrs. Cranky's got it, hasn't she? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got it this time, you see if we haven't. This was George's marvellous medicine number 4. And when it was boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him, and Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a spoonful to that one over there. And he pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with the new medicine on it. Chick, 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 he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon and then went, ow! It said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that? Keep quiet, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a chance. They stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a newly hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Well, that's the end. Oh, yeah, that's the end of that chapter. And the next one's called Goodbye, Grandma. We'll have to find out what happens, won't we, tomorrow? Take care, everybody. Bye.